Hi, Grandma here. I'm reading Ben and Me. And in the previous chapter, Ben Franklin is headed to London to try to prevent a war with England, but Amos stays behind because Ben broke his agreement about no more experimenting with electricity, having installed lightning rods on the ship. Chapter 9, War. Life at the vestry seemed very quiet after the excitement of living with Ben, but I felt the need of a little quiet just then, and the long days with my family were most enjoyable. Though life at the vestry was quiet, Philadelphia as a whole was not. Restless crowds filled the streets, and there were rumors of violence. There was loud talk of stamp taxes, and other outrages of the English government. I gathered that Ben's mission to England was a complete failure. The war finally started at some place in the province of Massachusetts, and I thirsted to do what a mouse could to aid the struggling colonies. There seemed little I could do, however, without Ben, and it gave me great pleasure to hear that he was about to arrive home. All our differences were forgotten in the face of the dangers that threatened our country, and we plunged into our work with the greatest energy. As far as I was concerned, the War of the Revolution was nothing but committee meetings. Ben was on dozens of committees. They met at all hours of the day and night, and I was kept so busy rushing about gathering information that I often longed for the old days of lightning rods and other electrical catastrophes. Our most important committee was one formed to write what they called Declaration of Independence. There were 5 on the committee besides me, but the only ones who counted were Ben and Mr. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Mr. Jefferson was a talker for fair, almost as bad as Ben. And they would never have made any progress had it not been for me and Red. Red had come up from Virginia with Mr. Jefferson in his saddlebag. I'm beginning to think this is another mouse. Like his patron, he was red-headed, a fiery revolutionist, and a great talker. Scarce had they arrived before Red began preaching revolution to the mice around the inn stables. He soon had them organized and led them on several forays, which caused the innkeeper considerable trouble with his guests. In spite of his radical tendencies, I could not help liking this young firebrand. We became fast friends, and I introduced him to many prominent Philadelphia mice of my acquaintance, who, though somewhat shocked at the violence of his theories, all admired his eloquence and capacity for leadership. This group held many interesting meetings in Red's saddlebag home, at which the problems of the day were discussed. At one of these meetings, Red brought forth for discussion a manifesto, or list of grievances which he felt we mice had suffered at the hands of our masters, man. It began, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a mouse to dissolve the bands which have linked him to his master," and went on at considerable length. That sounds very much like the Declaration of Independence, by the way, excepting for the mouse part. While many of those present felt that our wrongs were slightly overdrawn, everyone was impressed by the force of Red's writing. So deeply was I moved that I borrowed it to read to Ben. This I did after his committee had adjourned at a late hour, having accomplished nothing. As I proceeded with the reading, Ben showed increasing signs of excitement. At its close, he burst out with pleasure. "Splendid, Amos, splendid," he exclaimed. "It fits our case exactly. When in the course of human events, oh, magnificent. Just copy it down like a good fellow. Of course, change the word mouse to man wherever it occurs." "Are we mice or are we men?" I said. "Copy it yourself. I'm sleepy." He did copy it, and the next day it was adopted by the other members of the committee, all very much pleased with themselves for producing such a splendid document. Red, of course, was in a fury and orated for hours about this theft of his labors, but we all thought it a rather good joke on him. When on the 4th of July it was announced by Congress as the Declaration of Independence, there was a great celebration in Philadelphia. Bells rang, bands played, and men and boys paraded the streets, shooting guns, pistols, and firecrackers, a most terrifying racket. Ben, of course, joined in these sports despite my protests and was noisier than any of the youths. He managed to burn most of his fingers, but when he singed my tail severely with a firecracker, I finally rebelled, threatening to reveal who had really written the declaration. He quieted down then. Chapter 10, Belle France. And here's the picture before it. Of course, during these stirring times, I came in contact with all the great men of the colonists. The one who impressed me the most, naturally, General George Washington. Not only was he a magnificent figure of a man and soldier, but the wheat grown at Mount Vernon was of superb quality. There was always a few grains to be found in his boot tops and pocket flaps, quite a few crumbs too, so I always looked forward to seeing him. On one of his visits to Ben, however, he appeared greatly cast down. "This situation of our colonies, Dr. Franklin," he said, "is becoming desperate. Our brave soldiers lack shoes and uniforms, powder and arms. I fear that we must appeal to some foreign power for aid, but to what country should we appeal? That seems to be the question. Of course, there is Spain." "French pastry," I whispered in Ben's ears. "Oh, and of course France," said Ben. "There is Russia," said the general. "French wines," I hissed. "And France," said Ben. "There are Denmark and Sweden," the general said. "Beautiful ladies," I whispered. "France," said Ben. "Undoubtedly France." "Very well," said General Washington. "France it seems to be. Dr. Franklin, will you go to the court of France to plead our case? It is a heavy responsibility, for on your success depends our whole hope of victory." Ben rose. "We will, General, we will," he said determinedly. "We?" asked the general. I of course, I will," replied Ben. "When do we, I'd sail." "At once," said the general, rising and looking very noble. "The armed sloop Reprisal is ready to sail. With you, Dr. Franklin, will go the hopes and prayers of a new nation, the ideals, the aspirations." "And Amos," I added, but he didn't hear me. So we sailed, and the less said about the trip, the better. I always did despise water, and the Atlantic Ocean contained more ugly, gray, unpleasantly churned up water than I ever dreamed could exist. I was seasick, awfully seasick, and just to make things worse, Ben was not. He was disgustingly well and annoyingly active. He had a new theory for setting the sails, which he told the captain would greatly increase our speed. This kept him on deck for several days, to my great relief, but was suddenly ended by a tremendous outburst of profanity on deck. Ben entered our cabin, hastily followed by angry rumblings from the captain. "No vision, Amos," he said sadly. "No vision." "Blurred," I said. As you can see, Amos is not feeling well at all. Okay, chapter 11, at court. Wow, look at Ben Franklin with all the beautiful ladies. Something tells me it was the beautiful ladies that impressed him more than the pastries and the wine. At court, and of course that means like the king's court. Our voyage at last ended, although I was too far gone to know or care. By the time I had recovered, we were comfortably lodged in a house at Passy, a small town on the outskirts of Paris. Ben, for some unaccountable reason, proved to be tremendously popular with the French people. Scholars, scientists, and writers flocked to the house. They hung on his every word and talked of his lightning rods and kite flying as though they were something wonderful. Pardon, Grandpa. Pictures of him were sold in all the shops while his maxims were quoted everywhere, in French, of course. To me, they made even less sense in French than in English. As for the admiration of the French ladies, it was just plain silly. They swarmed around him like flies around a honey jar. They all called him Papa and used to cry if he refused their invitations to tea or dinner. Our mail was filled with their ridiculous notes, all highly perfumed. Some of the ladies went so far as to copy the untidy way in which he wore his hair, while others wore fur caps made in imitation of Ben's. One of them even tried to borrow my home for her milliner to copy. I put a stop to that promptly. We were surrounded by diplomats, politicians, and spies, all of whom were trying to find out what Ben was doing in France and, if possible, to prevent him from accomplishing it. Naturally, I was kept extremely busy watching all these people and telling Ben what they were up to. I became familiar with the desk of every ambassador in Paris, read everyone's mail, and listened to all their conversations. Of course, with the information I supplied, Ben was able to thwart every plot against us, thereby gaining the reputation of being a brilliant diplomat. While I worked myself to a shadow, he was growing fat on all this attention, not to mention the dinners he continually attended. He did do his part at court, however. The king and queen were just as silly as the rest of the French in their admiration for Ben, his maxims, and his quaint clothing. They especially liked the fur cap, which of course he wore everywhere. By flattery and smooth-tongued promises, he managed to borrow millions of francs for George Washington and his ragged army. As long as he secured these vast sums for the cause of liberty and justice, I didn't mind how ridiculous he made himself. But the sociability was wearing me down. Ben, I said finally, I've just been thinking of one of your maxims. He that goes a-borrowing goes a-sorrowing. Now, here you've come on one of the biggest borrowing expeditions of the age, but where's the sorrowing? You've borrowed millions from the King of France, and you're still the most carefree old rapscallion I've ever seen. Every evening it's dinner with Madame this or Countess that. Fools make feasts and wise men eat them, says he. All right, I said, all right. I won't try to match maxims with you, but this dinner thing is wearing me out, especially that Madame Helvetius, she and her cats. Oh, she has many important people at her dinners, he protested. She also has cats, I said, dozens of cats all over the house. And that pesky little yapping dog, my nerves are on edge all the time I'm there, Ben. I just can't stand much more of it. Besides, suppose something horrid were to happen to me. How could you get along? What would happen to our mission, to our army, to General Washington? Ben looked thoughtful. There is much in what you say, Amos. Forewarned is forearmed. Moreover, I dislike those cats as much as you do. And as for the dog, yes, you are right, Amos. It is too grave a risk. From now on, we must dine less often with Madame Helvetius, and more often perhaps with Madame Brilon. Now, I said, you show some glimmer of sense. If we must dine out all the time, let it be Madame Brilon. By all means, there's a lady for you. Not a cat in the entire house, and good food, too. So to my great relief, we ceased our visits to Madame Helvetius and her cats, dining several times a week with Madame Brilon. This suited me perfectly, for in addition to the good food and charming surroundings, there was Sophia. Well, I'm wondering who Sophia is. Sophia was a very beautiful white mouse from the court of Versailles, an aristocrat and a lady, if I ever saw one. A lady in distress, I soon learned. She lived in Madame Brillon's towering headdress, which made a really dainty home, very different from my rough frontier cabin type of residence. During the long, tiresome dinners, we visited back and forth a great deal. Her English was excellent, for she was beautifully educated, so we were able to converse freely. Having spent most of my life in the company of rather lowly church and tavern mice, I found her brilliant mind and beautiful manners a revelation. I soon became her devoted admirer and slave. Well, she need of an agile mind and a strong right arm, for she had been a victim of the most villainous intrigues and persecution by the white mice of the courts. The story of her wrongs, which she unfolded to me, is too long to set forth here. It is enough to say that as a result of a foul conspiracy, her husband, a member of one of the oldest mouthed families in France, had been exiled to America, while she herself had been obliged to flee from the court, leaving their seven children captives at Versailles. Her poor husband was now in Philadelphia, struggling valiantly to make a home in the new world for his family, should they ever be reunited. By the way, Versailles is the location of the French court. Sophia, when banished from the court, had sought refuge with Madame Brillon, whose kindness to the unfortunate was well known. Here in her protector's great white wig, Sophia served her in much the same capacity I did with Ben. As advisor and confidant, she was of the greatest value to her patroness, and since Madame Brillon often attended the court, Sophia was able occasionally to seek news of her children's welfare. Although never able to see them, she learned that they were held in a small cell directly beneath the Queen's throne. Her one desire in life now was to rescue these unfortunate young ones and join her husband in America, but the task seemed well nigh hopeless. Not only was I touched by her beauty and helplessness, but all my Republican sympathies cried out against these wicked injustices by the pampered aristocrats of a dissolute court. "Madame," I cried, "do not despair. Though of humble birth, I never played no small part in the affairs of men and nations. What a mouse can do, I will. I, Amos, solemnly swear never to rest until your wrongs are righted and you are happily joined with your children and husband in our beautiful city of Philadelphia, USA." Tears filled the beautiful pink eyes at my words. "Oh, Monsieur Amos," she said softly, "could you but accomplish this? What happiness would you bring to a bereft family?" "Fear not, Madame," I said. "To a true son of liberty and justice, such a task is a mere nothing. Have courage and trust in Amos." And here's a picture of Madame and Amos, Madame Sophia, and she's drying her tears on a white handkerchief. Well, we're going to pause here, but we have chapter 12 talks about plans. So it looks like there's some serious planning going on. And then we have finally the Battle of Versailles. Now, Grandpa and I have been to Versailles. It is located outside of Paris. It's not in Paris. And at one time, the French had several courts. They had one in Paris, and Versailles was considered the country court. But I think that by this time, it was the primary residence of the King and Queen of France. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.